Collins Andrews. I'm the current president of the Arkansas Academy of Computing. And today I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Bob Crisp, who's one of the founders of the Academy. Bob's been in the computing industry for 50 years. He was a teaching assistant that helped teach the first programming course at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville in 1963. After he received his master's, he worked for IBM and then left to pursue a doctorate at the University of Texas, which he completed in 18 months. He came back to the University of Arkansas, his alma mater, in 1967. He worked in the Industrial Engineering Department and actually initiated the Bachelor of Science in Computer Science in the College of Engineering. Dr. Crisp was one of 5 people who were the founding members of the Department of Computer Science Engineering, of the Department of Computer Science Engineering Department, with name changes and mergers, which is now, the CSCE department. Bob's an Arkansas computing industry legend. And when Arkansas people talk about their introduction to computing, if they have any connection at all to the University of Arkansas, they know Bob Crisp. And they have a story to tell about how Bob helped them. So Bob, let's get started.
Okay, good.
And that is
good.
Quite true. So to start this discussion, would you talk some about your life, your early life, long before computing entered the picture, where you were raised and your parents and their education and your family circumstances?
Okay. I'm rather unique in the sense that I have roots that go back in Arkansas to pre-statehood. Wow. So my roots go back into Madison County and St. Paul and Lincoln, Arkansas. So I grew up in Fort Smith. Fort Smith was the town in which I was born. It's a town in which I went to school, graduated from high school. So that is my hometown. Had a very standard family in the sense of a mother and a daddy that stayed together, and one sister, and grew up in Fort Smith, which was an awfully good town to grow up in the sense that it was big enough that you got to know a few people. They had good schools. We had chemistry, we had physics, we had the other items which many schools didn't have, and I was able to take advantage of that, and did take advantage of that. Although I was never a serious scholar until probably when I got into graduate school. So both through high school, I was the party guy. I was more interested in the next party or the next girl or the next whatever. So I was never really serious about school, but I could get by and did get by.
What is a serious scholar? What do you mean by that term?
Well, school was not a priority to me.
Okay.
I found much of it interesting, but it was. And quite frankly, I don't mean this to be self-serving, but it was easy for me. I was never really challenged in school until I got further along, and then having gone to a high school that offered a very good math, science, physics, and so forth program, when I came to the University of Arkansas, my freshman year was a repeat. A repeat of really what I'd done in high school, so my freshman year was actually pretty easy. So I was never a serious, hard-working, scholarly type student who put academics first until I got into graduate school and realized, okay, this is what I wanted to do.
What is it about, what got you to make the decision that you wanted to pursue a graduate education? How'd you decide that? Had you worked before?
The quick answer to that, which I've been asked that many times, Collins, is why did you go to graduate school? And I immediately say Vietnam. Oh. So when I was graduating in 1962, in the midst of the Vietnam War, then there were really 2 options sitting out there for me. If I graduated and went to work, then I was under the gun of the draft. So graduate school was in a deferment. Now this was back in a world that I don't necessarily approve of, because there were so many different deferments that those of us that had connections and other things and our families could do, we were able to dodge the Vietnam War, and that's what I did. I was, quote, a draft dodger. It was not something I wanted to do. So
Yeah, and I certainly understand that, and I think
I don't mean to get into politics here at all.
Yeah, and it is interesting that in that time period, in the 60s, many people who were in school or of that age made decisions related to the draft and the military.
Well,
that
as you know, there was such a
influenced
dichotomy.
a lot of careers.
There was such a dichotomy between those that were for the war and then all those hippies and other people who were against the war, and so.
So when you so then what happened after the first graduate degree? Then what did you do?
Well, I went through and got a degree in industrial engineering, and so when I graduated, which in those days you actually graduated after Christmas. Now then we have graduation before Christmas, but in those days you went off for Christmas and came back and took finals, and you had graduation in January. So I graduated with my degree in January of '63, which you're not going to see now, and because of Vietnam and the fact that I like graduate school, I decided to go to graduate school. Plus, I had had contact with a man named Ray Wilkes. Now, he is long since deceased, and we inducted him into the Academy posthumously because of his contributions. He established the first computing center at the University of Arkansas. And so he was a faculty member in industrial engineering. It could have been electrical, it could have come from anywhere, because they were just looking for anybody who had the interest and willingness to come over and take over this, and Ray Wilkes did that. And because I was in industrial engineering, then I had gotten to know him, and he established the computing center. So when I graduated, I had actually a couple of options. One was to be a teaching assistant, but the other was to go to work for him in the brand new computing center at the University of Arkansas with our shiny new IBM 650. And so I wrote my first program in 1963, January of 1963, on an IBM 650. And when I was reflecting before I came in to see you, Collins, I thought, okay, what are items that really stand out to me over these long years? And that first program that I wrote on an IBM 650 stands out as something that was just giant.
Well,
it was just giant.
How did you know how to do that? how did you learn that?
Everything was so primitive. In order to I'm not sure that we'll ever get people young people to fully appreciate how primitive things were. First of all, and I've got some here, so I'll pull them out. It's a good time to get props, maybe. We had cards, and everything was cards. It's the only way you can communicate. And so the IBM 650 was a machine that read cards, performed calculations on it, and then punched cards. So you had cards in, calculations, cards out. Now, in order to get this started, we had no such thing as an operating system in 1963. They only appeared about 3 or 4 years later, the very first operating system. So they didn't occur. So you went to the machine, and it had a set of dials. And you set this to the right settings, which was actually a bootstrap instruction. Now, bootstrap is something that you may recall, and others that are old in the industry may recall, but young people won't necessarily understand that bootstrapping was, in effect, said to read the card and start to load and so forth, okay? So no operating system, you had to give it the instruction. So you'd set that and hit a go. Now this was a one person only could do this. And so that's how I wrote my first program, and it was they had some people, Charlie Blackstock, who was inducted in the first class, who was ahead of me, and he gave me some instruction and so forth, and some books to read and so forth. And so I was off and rolling,
I mean, I think
and
that-
loving
yeah,
it,
yeah.
loving it.
Yeah,
Just
probably the
love-
point of that is those who learned to program in those times essentially learned it on their own in some way or another.
We really did. They had about 4 or 5 of us graduate students that they brought in, and we were pretty much on our own. Nobody knew exactly where we were going, and so there was a lot of leeway. Although our primary job was to help anybody that came in. So if we had faculty members who didn't really know how to do anything, it might come out of physics, chemistry, you name it, and had something they wanted to know if this could be done on a computer, then our job was to sit down and work with them and so forth and help them along.
So what were the computers used for that were the first computers at the University of Arkansas?
Collins, I make a giant distinction between 2 things. The early stages of computers were data processing. And that old term, which is hardly used today, you don't hear somebody say, "What do you do?" "I do data processing."
Yeah.
You don't hear that at all anymore. Back in the 70s, you heard it all the time. "What do you do?" "I do data processing." Now, what you had in those days is you had data and you had a program. And you put them on a computer and then you went off and sat down. Okay, I mean, or came back a day later or whatever, because then we were processing data. So a chemist would have some data that they had collected from experiments, or a physicist, or various people. Some of the ag guys were really big on this stuff from some of their experiments out in the field and so forth. So they would bring in their data and they would have a program and we would help them write it. But many of them would pick up elementary Fortran programming, and we would then help them. And once they were on their own, then they were on their own. So we just got them started.
So most of that was probably calculations and then end results and
That's right.
tables.
You
and
had
things.
data, you had a program, you wanted to be able to condense this, to summarize, to some kind of taxonomy, however you wanted to come up with it. And so if it was an ag person, they want to know why, trying to correlate rainfall or some other parameter they were using to what kind of yield they got.
How much demand was there at that time for the use of that computer, and then demand on you guys' time that were working with it?
It was big, Collins. It was big primarily because you got to remember the 650 was a 1 person at a time machine. It would be like having a PC that's sitting here, okay, but only 1 person can do it. But you got a thousand people out here that it wasn't that many at that time, but all these people, but they had to get in the line, and so we actually had a sign-up chart. And so you signed up for an amount of time on the sign-up sheet in order to get time on the computer. So there was a book that we kept in the calendar, and it would go out a couple of weeks ahead, and you'd sign up for some time, and that was your time. I know, it's funny. It seems so primitive, and it was.
So after you got a master's degree and stayed in school for that, then I believe you went to work, and then after a while, then left work and went back to get a doctorate. So what was going on there?
Okay, when I finished my master's, there was something, and I didn't realize this until afterwards, Collins, unique about me. It was unique in that, and we've talked about Bob Oliver and other people hiring people, and I was one of the very first to go to an interview that had computer experience, who walked in and said, "I know how to program." They'd never seen somebody. And so I was one of the first to ever walk into an interview and say, "I know how to program." And they were just ecstatic with all of this. "You know something about computers?" And I said, "Well, I don't want to brag about it, but I've worked on a 650 and I've taught classes and I've done this and that." So they were all over me. They loved the idea that here was somebody that they were not going to have to invest quite as much training into. And it worked greatly to my advantage when I took the job and went to work for IBM. I had some other job offers, but nothing. Once I interviewed with IBM, it was all over. I knew what I was going to do. So I went to work in Little Rock, the Little Rock office, and worked for IBM. And now the first part of IBM back in those days was going to school, but because I had some background, they short-circuited some of the schools and let me go a faster route than somebody who had no background whatsoever. So I got a little faster route, which again worked to my advantage.
So what did you do for IBM?
I had the option. They hired me as a salesman. And I had worked 6 years to get an engineering master's degree, and they wanted me to be a
I
salesman.
think it is kind of interesting that you just described an ability to program, and then you
I
kind of
know.
evolved into a salesman pretty quickly. I mean, that probably means something.
It does. They wanted me to be a salesman, but everybody, they had two people, salesmen and systems engineers, but they worked very close together. The salesman would be the person who could talk to people and convince them and so forth. And the systems engineer was there to back them up so that if they ask a technical question or they did any of this, and the old could you do so-and-so question, then the salesman would defer then, and that was our job to back them up, to say, yes, we can do that, or no, that would be very difficult, or no, not, whatever the answer might be. So you had the two different types of people. Now you started with IBM in those days, and you would go to what I'd call a 6-week boot camp, and it was brutal. I mean brutal. I don't know whether George or others have talked about going to that first school, but I went to this school in New Orleans for 6 weeks, and there were people there from Georgia and South Carolina and Mississippi and other states, and there were 18 of us. I remember this real well, okay? And they would put us in this school in New Orleans, and we were going 12 and 14 hours per day, 6 days a week, and try and get off Sunday. We'd usually drink Saturday night, rest up on Sunday, and be back at it on Monday. Because it was competitive, because they'd give you all these tests, and they always had a class rank.
Isn't that interesting?
Oh, it was brutal. It was, and you had to dress according to their code, and they gave you this code. I don't want to get off on too many tangents here. But they said, this is going to be the dress code. You will wear a dark suit. You will wear a white shirt. You will wear a striped tie. You will wear black shoes. You will wear socks that go over the calf. You had to wear socks that wore over the calf. And while I was at school, they called me in and they said, Bob, you look awfully young. I didn't know how to answer that question.
Right.
You know, I was at a total loss.
I'm happy about that.
I hadn't thought much about it. And then they looked at me and they said, Bob, we think it'd be a good idea if you were to wear a hat. and I'm thinking, am I in the right place? Here I am, 24 years old, and they're talking to me about wearing a hat.
This is interesting.
And I said, well, yes, I guess I could do that, but I can tell you, my take is that I'm going to feel so uncomfortable wearing a hat and wanting to take it off and put it on. I don't think I'm going to be very effective with a hat. I don't think that's a good idea. So then later they told me about some IBM research that they had done. And I think this is an interesting story if nobody else has told it.
No, they have not.
That they had done research, and they said, okay, you start with a guy with a sport coat, and you let him walk in and see a secretary in order to get in to see the vice president, okay? So they had done that, and he walks in with a sport coat, and then what are his odds of getting to that? Okay, then they put the person into a suit, then a suit with a tie, all right? Each time the probability would go up. Then they gave the person an umbrella. Odds go up. Then they gave the person a briefcase. Odds go up. Then they gave the guy like a raincoat to carry over their shoulder. Odds go up. Gave him a hat. Odds go up. And the question becomes, where does it end? And they said, it never ends. It never ends. The more you can give this guy to carry, the more likely they found it was for him to get in to see that vice president. And in the back of my head, I was saying, hell, you need a wagon to carry all that stuff. So it was amazing. But I remember in school, one guy one day walked in with a light blue shirt. Not a white, light blue shirt. Looked great. They sent him back
home.
and made him change shirts and come back.
Yeah.
So that's how, but it was hard to argue with IBM's success. You know, I couldn't say that was wrong when you looked at how well they were doing. So while I didn't personally, you know, it was adapting from the school life of blue jeans and T-shirts over to here you are in a tie and socks that got to come over your calf and all this other stuff. So I went to that first boot camp, and I'll be rather candid. I was running about third out of the 18 and doing real well. And then at the end of the session, then they came to oral presentations. And so we go through oral presentations, and I don't do well at all, particularly on the oral presentations. Now later, when I was critiqued about it, they said, Bob, you talk way too fast. You just come in and you know this stuff, and it's like you've just got to spill it all out, and you've got to learn to go slower. And so, you know, after one critique, and I walked in and I tried to slow myself down, and the next thing I knew, I was back up to full speed, you know, just going. And so I dropped from third to fifth of oral presentations in that class. Now, the classes, different people. I was sent there from the Little Rock office, okay? The Little Rock office said, we put a claim on him to bring him back. All right. Other offices could do the same thing, but a bunch of these people were ad-free, meaning any office could say, I want that person, and so forth. Now, I was not an ad-free person because Little Rock had a claim on me and said, we're sending him down, but that's the way they worked. So being high in the class was important because then you would have options. You might have three offices that say, we want you. So you might have had Atlanta, you might have had Jackson, Mississippi, you might have had New Orleans as your choices. I didn't have that. I probably could have, but I was tied to Little Rock.
Well, that's also an interesting story about the culture of IBM and the structure of IBM and kind of what it was like back in those times, because you know some of those behaviors are probably not the way companies lead their employees today.
With guys like Google, where you get a day off to do whatever you feel like, you're walking in sandals, blue jeans or cutoffs, and a torn-up T-shirt today.
It may be somewhat different. So then talk about what I guess was essentially a decision for a career in academia rather than a career in business. So you must have made that decision.
Let me hit just a little bit of my IBM work.
Yeah.
They kept me in Arkansas, and I was working with some accounts. And so I had an Allied telephone, and I had a bank. Interesting story that I want to relate about working with this bank. They sent me out to this bank and setting up the equipment, and it was to compute interest on CDs. And I said, okay. And this seemed terribly routine to me, and it was terribly routine. And I said, okay, I need to know your rules on computing interest on CDs. And they said, well, here's what we do. You know, somebody puts some money into an account, and then if later they come to get some of their money back, then instead of saying that most recent money was the money that they're taking out, they go to the older money and say that's what they're taking out. And I took that back and I said, wait a second. Went through it, and I went back and I said, are you aware that it would be possible for somebody to come up with negative interest if you follow this? And I've got this guy that looks at me, huh? And I said, I don't think you want to have negative interest and charge people for having a savings account. because of the way we compute interest. Our solution to it was if interest negative, then zero. That was the solution. And I have laughed about that forever. If interest negative, then zero. So that was one of the accounts. I had others. I recall, I don't know how far we want to go. If I'm lagging, then get me, Collins. Salesmen would sell too much in the sense that they would say, oh, of course I can do all that. Mm-hmm. So I had an account, and I went out and looked what I was supposed to do and got started on it. I said, it can't be done. I can't figure out with a very limited storage. You got to remember how little we had in those days. I can't figure out how to do this. With the memory I've got, it just doesn't, it's not going to fit, and I went over my code, and I did all this stuff. And I finally said, well, okay, I'm going to have to attack this problem different. Okay, you may never have, I had never thought of this, but did you know that you can do 2 simultaneous additions?
No.
Okay, I didn't either at the time, except I was so desperate to come up with a solution, I had to add some numbers together. Okay, if you were to take 2 numbers that you're going to add together, all right, and then put, say, 6 zeros. Now, these were small numbers, about 3-digit numbers. And if you put 6 zeros on the end of each one of those, and then take your regular numbers, so they're over at the far right, these are at the far left, add the 2 numbers together. Okay.
I do understand what you're saying now, because the zeros would never, there would
zero,
always be a zero in there.
That's right. There'd always be padded out with zeros. So that hit me, and it solved the problem. But it took me about 2 days. Sweating, how am I going to make this thing work? Because he sold it.
That does bring up a question about, and this may apply to business today, I think it probably does, but the relationship between those who sell the computing discipline and those who deliver the service of the computing. What was that like then, and was that a source of constant conflict?
I wouldn't quite call it rising to the level of constant conflict. But I would call it sometimes conflict. That salesmen were so eager to close that if somebody asked, could it do this or could it do that, they were so anxious to say yes in order to close the account. And then we were forced to go in behind them sometimes and make all this work when they hadn't sold enough equipment for the job we had.
Yeah, I had one of my bosses who you have mentioned so far in this interview used the term points of instability.
Yes.
And that was a conflict that was a point of instability. Okay, so move on to
let's
move on to grad school and,
okay.
and the academic career.
Now, I had only been with IBM a short amount of time when I realized, as much as I liked IBM, and I have the greatest respect for IBM, I did then, I do now. What I found out was that I was not a corporate world person. I am not that kind of person. And so I requested early on, I'd like to go to research and development. And they said, Bob, you're qualified, and that would be good, but we need you in the field. We've got these accounts. And so I was on a special assignment in Mobile, Alabama, on the International Paper account. Now, I'm sure you've been around paper mills before,
I have.
okay?
Yeah.
They don't smell good, okay? They are not fun places to work. And I was in Mobile on a pilot account that if it worked, they were going to deploy to all of theirs. So there were millions of dollars involved in this account. I hated that job. I mean, it was not fun at all. I didn't like the paper industry. I didn't like what I was doing. I didn't like any part of it. And I remembered my teaching, so I said, I'm going to go back to school. I had contact with a previous professor who had moved to the University of Texas, and I got in touch with him, and he said, come on here and get a PhD, and we'll give you an assistantship, and we think we can get you a Ford Foundation Fellowship. And I said, I'll be there. So I left IBM after 15 months with a wife and a 3-week-old baby in a 1969 Volkswagen. No, it was a 1959. Let me back that up. 1959 Volkswagen, pulling a U-Haul trailer that was bigger than the Volkswagen.
Yeah, it would be. Certainly.
Going downhill was a real thrill. And went from Mobile to Austin. And now here's an important item. it sounds like I'm bragging about being able to complete a PhD in a very short amount of time.
Yeah,
and it
it
was
a
a very
short
short.
period of
people.
time, yeah.
Now, here's what happened there. I walked in and I was a computer guru. Not that I was any better than any of the thousands of others with IBM, but I walked onto a campus and I knew how to do all this computer stuff. And they didn't have anybody on campus that knew how to do it. Well, it didn't take me long to figure out, okay, I could get through the coursework, but the dissertation is the thing that slows you down. And I thought, wait a second, what I've got to do is use my computer skills, because none of these guys will understand what I'm doing. It's going to be, it's, you know, they're going to accept it, they're going to love it, they're going to say that's exciting, they're going to do all this stuff. But to be able to say whether what I did was right or wrong, or how good or how difficult or how anything it was, they didn't know this stuff. So I used my computer skills, and it was in an theoretical area of queuing theory, which I don't want to get into too far, other than to say I was able to do that on a computer and get results that nobody had ever seen before, because nobody had
ever done it that way.
They never had a computer where they could do that kind of calculation. So that's why I zipped through. It was purely just riding the coattails of the knowledge that I got with IBM.
So what, then where did, I'm assuming somewhere in here, there became an awareness of a love of teaching.
Yes.
It must have happened.
It happened when I was in graduate school at Arkansas. So while I was getting my master's, they let me teach a couple classes, which I loved. Then I went to Texas, and I loved it again. So I realized that the academic world and teaching and working with students was a love I had. But the other thing that got me most of all to go to the academic world was academic freedom, that I could work on whatever I wanted to. And that was the thing that sustained me. I could work on something, and if I got bored with it, tired of it, hit a dead end, whatever it might be, I could quit it and move to something else. And the university was always happy as long as I was doing something, doing research, productive, bringing in money, presenting papers, all the other things they expect in the academic world. And that was the world that I wanted, the world I loved. I loved the freedom. I loved every bit about it.
What is it, what is it about teaching? What is it that I guess, inspired you? Why was that something that was important?
I'm going to answer this, Collins,
Yeah.
the way a million other teachers will give you the exact same answer. That you're able to go into that classroom and you're able to present something that is technically obtuse, technically difficult, tricky, and you're able to then work your way, and you see those eyes out there, and you suddenly see the bells ring, and wow, they're getting it. They're getting it. And it's just the love of the kids and the love of conveying that knowledge. Young people are just wonderful to work with, and at the risk of sounding too special, engineering has its own way. Not that many people get into engineering, okay? Those that do don't, many of them don't make it. Only about half make it through their, less than half make
Right.
it through their freshman year. So when you get up to a sophomore, junior, and senior years, you're really getting a very select group of people. They are good. They are really good, okay? And the opportunity to teach those, oh, it's great fun. Great fun.
This deviates a little bit from the way I would like to go the script, but is there a difference in the students that you taught in the 70s and the students that you taught until you retired here in the 2000s? Or is that, or are those reasons for being inspired the same?
No significant difference that I recall. I felt that in later years that we were having students that certainly by the time they were getting up to their freshman and senior year, which is what I pretty well, in graduate school, that I was working with, that they were better prepared, better disciplined. They were in many ways better than what I had seen in earlier years. So, but not a big giant difference. It was essentially the same. They're still young people. They're still hungry. Many of them were hungry for the knowledge.
Yeah.
And Good kids are good kids.
You did a couple things there at the university while you were involved in the engineering school that you're very proud of. And
I am.
Can you talk about
I am.
those?
One of them I want to talk about is the computer store. Now, IBM introduced the IBM PC in 1983, and that legitimized the PC. Now, until that time, with Apple and other people, the microcomputer had been a toy, a hobby, so forth, but it had not been a serious business machine. When IBM introduced it, they put their seal of approval. This is IBM, and we believe this can be a part of your organization, and it can do business work. And that was a giant, giant change. Okay, when that IBM PC came out, there was a whole bunch of us that wanted those machines. We had to have our hands on them, okay? We didn't have them, but we had to have them.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I, knowing IBM, call IBM and say, we want some of those machines, and we've heard about this academic discount, and we want in on that. We want to get the machines. And they said, well, that's fine, but there's some things you got to do. And so they sent me a package of all these rules and things you got to do. I read over the package, and I said at the end of it, okay, you got to have a display area so that people can come and look and so forth and so on. I said, hell, they're talking about a store. I mean, this isn't complicated. They're talking about a store. So I said, well, if we're going to do this, and I started out, I was really doing it for me and 2 or 3 other of my colleagues who all wanted to get computers. But I said, the university should have a computer store, because it's not just me and the 3 or 4 other guys. The whole university's going to want this deal. So I went to the guy who ran the University of Arkansas bookstore, okay? Now, part of this was funny. It was owned entirely then by the university. So all of the money went into that. So I went in and had a private conversation with him and said, here's what I want to do, okay? And he said, what kind of seed money are you going to need? And I said, well, I'm not going to need a lot, but the big thing is inventory. And he said, how much? And I said, well, I'm going to need probably 20, 30,000 to start with, but I think I can get our sales up to 100,000 in the first year. He looked at me, 100,000? 100,000? You think, you know how many books we got to sell to get to 100,000?
He'd been selling books and T-shirts, right?
Yeah. I said, and I think we can do a whole lot better after that. He said, Bob, I don't know whether you're right or wrong, but you know, I've got a problem. And I said, what's your problem? He says, you know, with this damn bookstore I've got, every time I get some profit and reserves, the university reaches over and takes it all away from me. And then I got to start all over. I can take that money and roll it back into you, and so it's a good investment. And if it works, it makes me look good and so forth. So he underwrote the whole deal. The university bookstore did. We set it all up. I got a couple of students and so forth, graduate students and so forth, and we started the computer store where we would have display, but incidentally, service quickly became a giant item. So we not only had to do it, but we also had to have the service. So service was 40% of what we were doing. And I remember being, because I was one of the few, doing sales work out on the floor of our little store in the early days to get it started. Now, one of the things that I have to tell you about me and me personally, I love to start things, but I get bored with them once I know they're going to work. So the computer store, once I knew it was off and rolling, then I was tired of it. Then I said, okay, you guys can have this. I'll go back to my office over and go back to teaching and have fun. And they eventually sold it, the whole store. The store got up to about $3 million a year in sales.
Really?
In 5 years, by the way. And they sold it, and I don't know how much money they made on it. So it was great fun.
Yeah.
Great fun.
So that's one item. And what about Genesis?
Genesis. Very shortly after the computer store, and it was one of the things that got me out of the computer store, was Genesis. Now, this was a time when the U.S. realized that we needed to do more in the technology area, that was paying great dividends. We had a technology edge, but we needed to push it further. And so there was federal money that was coming down in order to do technology. And part of this, they wanted startup companies. So we had our bigger companies, but they wanted startup companies. And they wanted to talk about an incubator or a way to get startup companies. And I went to John Allen, now retired, head of Arkansas Science and Technology Authority. And I went to him and I said, we want to do this. What we want to do is set up a software incubator. We want to have a place where people can come in and they can write programs and start their companies and do the software. So we want to set up a software incubator. And John, and I love John, I think he's one of the great guys. And John looked at me and he just said, Bob, think bigger.
Really?
Think bigger. You're looking at one technology. We want all of technology. And I had a look just about this long, and I said, John, I understand. I understand exactly what you want. I will be back, okay? I think it'll take me a month or two to put together pretty much a rough outline of what you're talking about, but I'll be back. So I went back and got tied in with some people over in chemistry, particularly biochemistry, which is something they wanted, which was very much an emerging field at that time. Got together with them and so forth, put it all together such that we no longer were computer-oriented, we were technology-oriented. Take that back to John. He bought into it completely. We got started. We had 3 initial clients that we put in there. It grew from there. And as I've talked about, after a few years, I got tired of it and went on my way, and it went on to become Incubator of the Year. It received several awards.
What are some of the things that came out of that? What some of the
well, we had people like those in HVAC, heating and air conditioning control systems. So that was a company. We did have some computer-related companies. We had some biotech companies, and I didn't try and do much work with them because I didn't understand. That was totally out of my expertise. But we had other guys connected to Genesis who would then take care of them and so forth. So
you brought with you, this is a subject change also, some what I guess we would term as artifacts. You showed the cards.
Yeah.
But what else is there that somebody who's seeing this video may not know what it is?
Okay, these are things that when I was with IBM that they gave me, and by hook or crook, I kept them. I didn't return them when I left. One of which was a sign they gave people, and this is they haven't made these in probably 40 years. This Think sign, but it was very much a symbol of IBM. This whole Think idea, and if you were to see this, you would immediately know you were talking about IBM. And they had these little notepads. Now, I think it's real interesting that here in the age of computers back then, what we want to do is give everybody a notepad so they can make handwritten notes, okay? But these were pads that they gave out. IBM on one side, Think on the other, cards.
Interesting.
And this is a template for making a flow chart. Now, remember the old days were data processing. I can't emphasize that enough, that it was later that really, and I think word processing changed the world. It's what made it personal, okay? But until then, we wanted to take this data where there's inventory data and okay, how did we move this data along and so forth and so on. And in order to do that, then you would lay out a flow chart. And here's the things, okay, and one of these is process, and one of these is input, and one of these is key punch, and so forth and so on. And you would draw up a diagram of how all this data and everything flowed and so forth, and what you came out in the reports you came out with then. So it's what you use to design the system.
Is that kind of design not done today?
It is done today, but we're no longer nearly that serial about things, okay? We've gone from that kind of data processing where you've got the data over here and the program here and they come together and so forth, to word processing where now it's individually interactive. And so while we're still doing payrolls and we're still doing inventories and we're still doing all of the other tasks, it becomes so easy and so common that nobody thinks about it. They still go on in every store.
You're still really doing the same kind of flow.
Everybody does them. but it's just not. It is not their edge. It's kind of the back room. Okay, we got to do it, but everybody knows how to do it.
You might argue that process taught people how to think, and nowadays people think in that manner anyway. I mean,
Yes.
that must really be it. So I want to shift gears again and talk about the state of Arkansas. And you, because of your long experience in Fayetteville in education, you saw many people who came through who also then contributed to the computing business in Arkansas.
Absolutely.
Can you name 2 or 3 people who you think
Well,
were really significant? I mean, I know there's, I
hate to name 2 or 3.
I know there's
because
66 of them or so. But, yeah.
Because the list goes
Yeah.
so long.
But I guess who maybe had the most impact that you know of?
Well, I'd have to start with Ray Wilkes, who's the
Yes.
guy that got me started. And I have a very strong feeling for Ray Wilkes. He had died prior to our creating the academy, and it's real sad to me that he was not alive to see that. So Ray Wilkes, who steered me and got me into this direction. So, but after I came back, and remember, I came from IBM, and I got to know all those guys.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I was in the academic world, but I was sitting here in Fayetteville, and right down the street from me lived Charles Morgan, Roger Klein, and George Knight. We were within a long stone's throw of each other, okay?
Yeah.
Now, the other 3 worked for IBM, and I worked for the university. We were all great buddies. And then there were others around. But they were certainly 3 guys that I became friends with, did a whole lot of stuff with. I used to go with Charles Morgan when he was racing motorcycles out. I wasn't about to get on that crazy stuff.
Yeah.
I'd die, okay? But I'd watch him and so forth. But Walter Smiley comes to mind certainly as a giant to me. Walter and I knew each other, and when Walter was starting up Systematics, and to me this is a funny story, academics does not give you a full-time job. It gives you a 9-month job or a 3/4 time job, okay? So every summer, and it was particularly bad in my younger years, you had to go find a job for the summer because I had a family that ate 12 months, but I only got paid 9 months. So I was always looking for a job. And I had contact with Walter, along about March or something, and said something about the summer. And Walter said, well, you know, we're just getting involved in this startup company. Won't you think about coming down and helping us out this summer? Because we got a bunch of things to do. So I went down that summer and worked with Walter, a guy named Jim Gaddis, who also died before the academy started. A guy named Christian.
That would be
Hatfield.
J.C. Christian was
Jason.
that guy.
Okay, good. Hatfield, somebody we hired that summer, which I remember in a very nice way because Hatfield doesn't seem to remember it this way, but I think my memory is better than him because I know what I went in to tell Smiley, okay? Because they had me give an early interview with Smiley. And I went in to see Walter and said, I talked to this guy, and he doesn't know crap. He doesn't know a thing. But he's got the right attitude. I think this is a guy that we need to think about. He doesn't know anything, but we don't have many people that do know anything about computers. So I think he's got the right attitude. So we hired Don Hatfield.
Of course, I had the good fortune of going to work for those guys, and I did work for Walter, and I did work for Jim Gaddis, and that.
Good. I'm glad you know him.
Yeah, that company had a culture of training that you probably were one of the people who helped start. But it was an educating company.
That was a part of that's what they wanted me to do in the time I was down there, to how to set up training and so forth. And then afterwards, we did some other things with them, setting up some voice over slides, and they made some machines back then. They had a screen on them, you put a tray of slides in them, and then you put an audio cassette, and they would take you through a training routine. I don't know if you ever saw one of those, but we wrote some of those and some other things. So.
Let me shift you over to a question that we really like these folks who are so experienced to address, and that's the issue of balancing those parts of your life that are important, work being only one of them.
Yes.
I know even from my experience in the computing business, it was and probably remains very intense and can be very time demanding. And how did you manage that issue of, and what were your balances?
I'd like to tell you they were good, Collins, but I think that most of us found that we had to run a roller coaster through all of that. And I recall one year in the later 80s, and I look back on that year and I said, wait a second, can you remember a Saturday you did not go in and work? And as best I can recall, there was one Saturday I could write down, I did not go in and work. That's how intense a whole lot of things were back then. Mm-hmm. That was way too much. I mean, when you're doing that, you're neglecting yourself, your hobbies, your family, I mean, everything else. And I recognized what it was. I recognized that I had overcommitted, that quite frankly, I had too much research going on. Mm-hmm. And when I had that much research going on, I had all these people and all these things going, I had to back down. And I just had to start to pull the lever back a little bit, and I did. To say balance, I always had two wonderful hobbies, and that was the outdoors, hunting and fishing, and hiking and canoeing and kayaking, and did all of those things. And so those were the big hobbies. I played golf when I was younger, then took up racquetball, ruined my shoulders, which killed me on golf. So no more. So racquetball killed my golfing career. So which should have been killed, by the way. It was something that should have been shot.
Many people say that. Yeah.
But you know, I had my hobbies, I had my friends, and the friends I made through this business. I wouldn't take anything from them.
Is there? Are you still connected to people who you've known in this business now that you have retired? And
I am. George and I go way back. Some of them I don't see nearly as often as I'd like to. I got to see Morgan this past year and sit down and talk to him for a while. Roger Klein and I had a good long conversation. So I see some of them. Some of them are up here. Doug Kuntz is up here. You can see him, run into him at various events and so forth. Yeah. So the answer is yes.
I remember a comment one time about our business where the statement, and it was Walter Smiley who made it. He said that the loyalty in our work is to the industry. It's to computing. And it is less to companies than it is to computing itself.
Yes.
And I think you probably are maybe an example of and have seen that bond that exists between people, certainly the people who built the industry.
Well, you know, I will point to Walter and particularly Jim Geddes as just being brilliant in building that company. I saw what they did, their ability to manage people, their vision for the future. Great people. I don't want to leave anybody out, but they were certainly two people that influenced me enormously. And I remember in that summer, it was only a summer that I was down there working, but we were having a discussion, and Geddes was saying, this is the direction, the economy, and so he went through, and he says we need to cut the throttle back. I was saying we need to push it forward, which was, and Geddes was right. One of the great things we can sometimes learn is from not those things that we do right, but those things that we do wrong.
Surely.
Now let me throw in one quick one because it's on my mind. When I started up Genesis, I didn't know that much about entrepreneurial activities. I mean, here I am, 30-something years old, maybe 40, somewhere along in there. I've never started a company. I don't know that much about it. But I say, who in the state of Arkansas knows more about entrepreneurial activities? Who is number one? And the answer to me was John Jacoby. Now, you know John Jacoby, and you may agree with me, but he's going to rank in the top 5 or 10 on anybody's list.
I would not have thought of him, but you're absolutely right. He is the person. Yeah.
Okay, I had a heck of a time getting an appointment with John Jacoby. And when I finally did get an appointment, and I drive down to Little Rock because I want to hear what he's got to say. What do you do?
For anyone seeing this video who would not know who that is, he was a senior executive at Stephens
Okay, good.
Ick.
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
make sure that this isn't just a name that floats out there. He was. I'm going to call him the investing entrepreneurial genius at Stevens Incorporated during that time
That
period.
is correct.
Okay, so and I don't think I exaggerate one drop when I say that. And in the conversation that I had with Jacoby, I wanted him to tell me about the good things and do this and that. All John wanted to talk about was his failures. He would talk about this and say, yeah, and this is what I did wrong over here, and that's why that didn't work. And then I'd try and steer him over here over to the positive. Well, John, how about so-and-so? Oh, yeah, that worked out pretty well. And then he'd go back and test. It was funny. But I thought, okay, there's a lesson to be learned. There is a lesson. This guy is making sure that he understands those areas where he went wrong. Because it's easy enough to not repeat those. Don't repeat those mistakes. Stay over here on this side. But I found it real interesting, that conversation, that I had so much trouble getting him to talk about success when he wanted to talk about failure.
And he
you know,
probably
what kind
wanted-
of guy would do that?
Yeah.
You know, most folks that want to brag, and he, you know, there he is talking about.
He was
his
really
fa-
talking about what has he learned, and
That's
you know,
right.
That's where he
And
learned.
how do you learn it?
Okay, we need to wrap it up, but I
Okay.
want to close with
I'm sorry,
a what if you were to deliver a message as a person who has had a lot of experience and learned quite a bit in this business, what kind of message would you deliver to those that are starting up? What would you say to them about someone who may have an interest in this in the computing field? What should be an important thing for them to know?
Well, I think I'd start out, Collins, and make sure that you've got a passion for this. I think you've got to have a passion. You've got to love the fact that there are a bunch of things that you don't know, that are just outside your grasp, and you really want to get to know them and to understand them, or to break through and make that work. Or so give somebody a problem, and you want them to be the kind of person, I don't know for sure how to do that, and therefore I love that problem. Okay, that's what I want. I don't want a problem I know how to work. I want a problem I don't know how to work. So I think that having that kind of passion, if you've got that part where somebody gives you something and they describe it, and you think, okay, I'm not sure that I know how to do that. Therefore, I want to work on it. I love it. Okay, so you need to have that passion. Beyond that, I'm not sure that the rest of it is, what do you like and what do you don't like. It can be financially a wonderful career. And certainly those of us that have been in the business have benefited financially very well. And so I don't think money is the reason you should do it, but money would never want to keep you out of it, okay?
Yeah, what an excellent guidance in that and I've heard that statement before, that you follow what you're passionate about. And if that passion happens to be through something that relates to computers, and today it'd be very hard to find a business that didn't in some way relate to computers,
Oh, and what I'd add to that, Collins, I'd like to say that I could have seen where we're going to be today. No. All I could see, and let me end this with, I made one giant prediction back in the late 70s. Computers were getting bigger and bigger, and we're getting more and more people connected, and we could do all this multi-processing. And I said, that is the future. So we had companies who were then farming out part of their computers. I said, what's the logical end of this? We're going to have giant computer utilities. They are going to be just like your electric company. You're going to go to a computer utility. That is the future of the world. And was I wrong? I was so dead wrong. It was a microcomputer. It was not making it bigger. It was making it smaller. That's what was exciting. And they came along, and once I saw that and realized that here's one more of your wonderful prognostications that has just gone in the bag.
Which probably means it's also almost impossible today to say what's it going to be like in 20 years or 40 years and so forth.
Let me end it on one item then. And this is not mine. It comes from Craig Thompson, and I think he put it. And I've loved this ever since he first gave me this concept. And it is everything is alive, and he sees a future where everything, your grass, your trees, your animals, your machines, everything is going to have intelligence, is going to be able to communicate with other things so that we'll have a totally connected world.
Awesome.
That is the future.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. I loved it, Colin. Great
All
fun.
right.
Great fun.